I think I'm going to, take this time to introduce our first keynote speakers. And the first topic that we're going to be covering is overcoming adverse childhood experiences in Alaska. And this is going to be Shirley Pittz and Patrick Sidmore, and giving you a little bit of background about them. I think you have their bios in your packets, but just for some summary, Shirley is an early childhood program manager for the Department of Health and Social Services. She facilitates the Strengthening Families program. She's also on the board of directors for the board for the Alaska Association for Infant and Early Children's Mental Health and other statewide boards. Shirley has also worked as a marriage and family therapist in child abuse prevention programs and in a variety of social service and education programs. Patrick is currently a planner for the Alaska Mental Health Board and Advisory Board on Alcoholism and Drug Abuse. He holds degrees in both economics management and social work. He has been focusing on early childhood mental health, and he has been instrumental in gathering adverse childhood experience information that is specific to the state of Alaska. So with that, I would like to turn the mic over to Shirley and Patrick for their presentation.
Good morning. Can you hear me? That's very unusual. Most people can never hear me. I have this very soft voice, and I'm always having to feel like I'm, yelling to be heard. So anyway, thank you for having me. I would like to say that I'm pretty impressed with what the committee has done to pull us together so quickly and to have a turnout. I think I heard this morning of almost 175 people in a short amount of time. So that's pretty awesome work. I'm usually on the other end of this. I do coordinate a conference, an annual conference in Anchorage. It's the Early Childhood Mental Health Institute. And I know a lot of work goes into this, so thank you for inviting me to join you today. Also, thank you for getting me out of the Anchorage weather. We've been setting records, as I understand Juneau has, for heat. We had a couple of days in the mid-80s, and then we've had the fires. So we had the fire up north and one on the Kenai Peninsula, and it's been pretty oppressive with this cap of smoke and hot weather. So I'm loving the rain, and I'm loving the cool. So let's launch into this. We have about 45 minutes, maybe a few extra minutes to talk, Patrick and I. And the main topic this morning is going to be adverse childhood experiences. So as we talk about the intersect of trauma with suicide, Pat's going to give you some of the data that we know about Alaska and what's happening. And my task is to spend just a few minutes to give you some information about brain development and stress and sort of how that interacts with the body and the brain, to lay the foundation so we understand these outcomes a little bit better. So with that said, and as Walter mentioned, my focus is really early childhood, so you're going to see a slant in here. And there's another good reason for that, is because we know so much about early brain development and how important those early years are in terms of development. So we're going to take a look about the developing brain and what happens when our body experiences stress. And so there is some concepts here that I hope to drive home for you, that our brains are built over time, that they are built from the bottom up, that it's a combination of what we bring in terms of genetics and biology, and that combination with experiences that helps our developing brain, that our brain is an integrated, that's not the right word, integrated is the word I'm looking for, integrated organ, and genes and experience are both involved, and then we're going to look a little bit at trauma. So let's launch here. So the first concept I'd like to share with you is the idea that brains are built over time. That we know that as we have expectant women having babies, that's a critical time for some of those neurons to be developed and the brain starts developing. And we know it's a critical time in terms of how the life of the mom is going, how much stress she's experiencing, what her nutrition is like, what her health is like. That is all critically important to the developing brain. We also know that by the time a baby is born, that there's 100 billion, at least, neurons that are part of that brain. Now, those neurons are not all wired and connected yet, but they're there and they're ready to go. And they're saying, come on, let's see some experience so I can develop here. So we have basic components of our brain developed by 1 month of age. And I like this little statistic about 700 neural connections, because that means for newborn babies and young children, every time you snap your fingers, another 700 connections are made in the brain. So we have all these neurons we're born with, but the task then becomes, how do you get that all wired together? So every time you snap your fingers, 700 connections are made for a baby. So clearly this is happening at a pretty rapid rate. So this next slide shows these neural connections, sort of a rough picture. So 75% of the brain growth happens by the age of 3. So this brain is busy with experiences, wiring things up, and just developing all these connections. So that by the time a child is 7, you can see how much brain growth has happened. So when I have an experience, let's say I'm a young child and I'm fussy, and I have a parent who comes and interacts with me, there's a whole bunch of connections that happen. And if I have a responsive caregiver who's really taking care of me, that becomes a highway that gets very well developed. Now, I may have lots of other experiences that don't happen repeatedly, that aren't significant. And what happens then is I start to prune those highways. They don't really become well developed. So I prune what I don't need. So we talk about it, use it or lose it. And that's very true with brain development. That if I have repeated experiences and it calls on me to do certain things or I respond a certain way, that's what stays with me. And everything else starts to fall away. So you can see by the age of 15, it looks like we've done a lot of pruning. Make sense so far? Okay, built over time. Now we have this idea that brains are built from the bottom up. So everything doesn't come online all at the same time. So we can see by this slide, the first thing that really gets hooked up and wired well are our senses. So that hearing, vision stuff comes on pretty early. And then we start to look at things like language, and then our higher level cognitive functioning comes online. And what's interesting about this slide is until you get to that line above age, that's in terms of months. And then we go to years. So you can see the rapid connections that are made before a child's even 1 to 2 years of age. Now, of course, we know that it doesn't all happen then, that we can change our brains later and there's continuous wiring going, but those early years are really critical. The other thing about the brain is that it's sort of open. So, for example, if you think about language, when a child is born, they could learn to speak any language in the world. And the reason they learn their language, of course, is because they hear it over and over again. But I could have been just as proficient with Russian as English if that's what I had heard when I was young. So there's some things we should take away from that. For example, we introduce languages usually in high school. Maybe we should do that earlier. So there's all kinds of opportunities that we can take advantage of. So now let's get really to the meat of the brain development. So this is sort of a picture that shows some of the parts of the brain. But the things that I would really like you to pay attention to, number one is the center part of the brain, which is sort of the emotional part of our brain. And I am not a neuroscientist, so you can't ask me any detailed questions, okay? But this is like out there for everybody to learn. So one of the parts of our brain that's really important is the amygdala. And that's, if you can think of your thumb as being amygdala. And that's really our fear hub. So that's kind of our fight or flight thing. So when something happens, that goes on high alert. Our hippocampus is pretty important because that's where we create and file memories. And some of those memories are very deep and subconscious, and some are much more conscious. We have our prefrontal cortex, which is really our judgment, where we make decisions, how we do planning. Sort of our empathy for other people can be connected there. And the prefrontal cortex helps us to control the amygdala, that flight or fight thing. So if you think of your hand as a brain, and this comes from Dan Siegel and Mary Hartzell, you've probably seen this. So one way to remember some of these parts, and the names aren't really as important as their function, is this forearm and your wrist are like your spinal cord. And then this is sort of your fear, your emotional center. And this is your cortex, where you're doing your thinking, planning, judgment stuff. And so hang on to that, because when we talk about stress, we're going to talk about what happens with all this. So remember that the brain is integrated, that all of these parts don't work totally separately, they work together. And that's sort of a key concept with this. I wanted to share this with you too, because this talks about the malleability or the plasticity with the brain. And so it looks at the potential early on to really shape the brain and the brain's wiring. And that's why we talk about the early years as being so critical. If we could really help children make good, strong connections in their brain, wired for health, good judgment, if we do that early on, we don't have to make up for it later. So it's a lot easier to do it in the beginning, which is why I always talk about the first 5 years being so important. But it doesn't mean we can't make changes later. So we never want to give the message that, whatever happens those first 5 years, you're stuck with that. You can change it later. But it takes a lot more effort and a lot more energy. So the early years become really important because, number one, we're developing those circuits, how the brain gets wired again. I think it's like wiring a house. You have switches and plug-ins, but they got to get wired up to work. And a phrase that we use often are the neurons that fire together, wire together. So again, I use it, it gets hooked up. The more I use it, the stronger it is. For us, it helps create those lifelong expectations. And a gal by the name of Connie Lillis talks about what we call procedural memories. And it's this idea that these early experiences get really embedded, particularly in our memory centers, and become sort of in the background. We're not even aware that they exist. So they sort of set our expectations for how people are going to treat us. Are we lovable? Is the world a safe place? Am I going to be neglected? And that stuff gets rooted pretty early. Anything we do that we really don't think much about can be a procedural memory. And the example I like to use is driving to work. So do any of you get in your car in the morning and you head to work and you get there and you don't remember anything about the trip? Yeah? You go, oh my gosh, wow, I hope I was safe. I hope I wasn't speeding. Hope there wasn't anything interesting that I missed, because we're just thinking of other things and we get there. Or you get in your car and you're supposed to go someplace else and you wind up at work. Does that happen? It's like, oh, I missed that corner. It's because that sort of stuff just gets sunk very deep. And all those critical expectations for how we have about life and who's going to love us and are we going to be taken care of can get embedded very, very early. And then we also talk about these early experiences can contribute to our stress thresholds, or how easily we get triggered, how easily we respond to anxiety. As you can probably tell, I'm anxious this morning, so my little amygdala is like, I'm usually coordinating the conference, So the message we always give about early childhood, too, is that when these babies come into the world, they are wired for relationships. They are biologically set to engage, to attach, to bond with somebody. They're ready, and you've probably all seen this if you have children or you've been around young children. And that makes sense, doesn't it, when you just look at the biology? Because they're really wired to survive, and they're totally dependent. So they have to have somebody who cares about them and needs them. And so that's pretty deep in our biology. But we talk about the magic here being the serve and return. So it's the idea again, I'm a child, I'm very fussy, I have a caregiver who says, oh, what's wrong with you? Are you okay? What can I do? Are you too hot? Are you hungry? Are you cold? Somebody responds to me. Or I have a caregiver who comes up and interacts with me and says, oh, you're so cute, and I smile back, and we go back and forth. So it's like a tennis game, it's like a waltz, we go back and forth. And that's the thing that really nurtures this brain development. The other key about that is that if we need to do interventions, the earlier we can do interventions, the better, because we have so much plasticity and so much opportunity with these young brains. So really quickly, I want to talk about the adolescent brain because I suspect many of you work with teens. What we know, it's kind of interesting, is now we know that this is really quite a dynamic period for brain development also. That it's not just our little kids. I think we kind of take a break and then we're adolescents. So I was telling somebody last night outside my hotel window, I had some very active adolescents, about 6 of them celebrating something. I don't know what it was, but I was thinking about this brain development as they were out there having a good time. Because one of the things that we know about teen brains is this part, the prefrontal cortex, where your judgment, good planning, impulse control lives, isn't really online. It's not the best developed part of a teenager's brain. Their amygdala is pretty developed, so they're a lot more emotional and respond, to emotions more. That little reward center in their brain, that's pretty well developed, which is like, I need a big reward, I need it now, I can't delay it, I can't put it off. So if you think about teens, it really explains a lot of their behavior. The really good news about this is that they're having a second wave of this gray matter development. So this is another good opportunity for us to think about how do we support teens in learning how to make good decisions, how to delay gratification, how to be more empathetic. It really creates an opportunity, another really good opportunity for us to say, we can rewire this. For teens to say, oh, that's what's going on with my brain? Okay, I'm going to focus on this. We know that teens, because of where they're at with brain development, are a lot more susceptible to alcohol and substance abuse. They're more sensitive to it, not only now, but it makes them more sensitive in the future. And the other thing that's kind of interesting about teenagers is this ability to recognize the emotions of other people. They use a different part of their brain to do that than adults do. So they don't always get it right. So somebody looks at me funny, and I make a whole story up behind that may not be accurate. So we have to cut our adolescents a little bit of slack while we help them through this period. The other thing, I just got a new report across my desk that I'm very excited about. It's about now when we're new parents, we've just had a new baby, is another opportunity for brain wiring. So because of all of this stuff that happens when we're a new parent, we also have some brain growth. And it's primarily in these 3 circuits. Our reward circuit, it's so satisfying when that baby takes a little look at you and smiles, don't you just, you just feel that. Our social information circuit and our emotional regulation. There is something that helps us manage stress when we have new babies. And I always think about what is the power of breastfeeding, for example, in this period, because your brain then starts, producing all this oxytocin, which is very pleasurable. So this is another opportunity for us, and we have brand new parents to think about how we're supporting this brain growth. Unfortunately, sort of the downside of this is they have found that new parents who've experienced a lot of trauma in their own lives do not have the same significant changes that other parents do. But again, it's an opportunity for us to say, how can we support these parents really so they can enjoy some of these same changes? And the interesting thing about this too is that it's not just moms. This brain development happens for dads. So that's why we really want dads in proximity, if at all possible, when we have new babies born and new children in the family. Okay, I need to move or I'm going to steal Pat's time here. Something I won't talk very much about, but this is something I'm sure you're starting to hear more about, is this whole idea of epigenetics. So we used to think everything moved forward through our DNA, and now we know that our experiences put some genetic tags on our DNA that can be passed forward into future generations. So this is a field that's kind of exploding and is really explaining why something happened to my grandparents, and I'm still showing the effects of it. It's really, really powerful information. So really quickly, we're going to go through this stress stuff. Don't you love that picture? Okay, I got to tell a story. So I was sharing these slides with Pat, my partner over here, and he was having a stressful day at work. So he forwarded this to his office mates, just the picture, and he said, I'm having a really stressful day. And what he got back, I believe, from his director was, but you have a great dress. So I can't show this slide without thinking about that. And somebody else, I think, chimed in and said, you got a nice bracelet, too. So anyway, but isn't this how you feel some days? It's like, oh, my gosh, here we go again. So we know that when we're experiencing stress, it sets off a whole lot of physiological changes in our body, hormones, reactions, and such. But stress isn't all bad, and we have to figure out how to deal with it. It's really healthy to have some stress in your life so you can figure out how to manage it. So there's positive stress, and that's the sort of thing that gets us out of bed, gets us to work, makes us do presentations like this. You just got to get a little adrenaline going. And I love this picture because I can see that in this kid, can't you? Can't you just see he's like, I'm learning to ride a bike, it's so exciting, and my heart rate's up, and wow, this is going to be fun. And then the health people give me a hard time because he doesn't have his helmet on, but. So that's good stress. Then we have what's called tolerable stress. And I would tell you most of this information comes from the Center for the Developing Child at Harvard, the way they've articulated this. So tolerable stress is when we have bad things happen to us, life's not going so well, but it's buffered because we have a positive relationship that helps us take care of that. So I'm upset, I go to my dad says, it's going to be okay, I'm going to be here, we're going to get through this, and I go on. So it doesn't have the neurological effects that it could have as if we had toxic stress, which means it's pretty intense, it's prolonged, and I don't necessarily have somebody to help me buffer that. That's when we're getting into some bad territory in terms of neurobiology and what happens with our brain development. So this whole stress management system, when we're activated, when we experience stress, the body responds to that. And that's good because that's kind of what keeps us alive. When we're threatened, the body gears up, the hormones gear up, and we're ready to deal with things. So the body activates hormones. We've all probably heard of cortisol and how that is elevated when we're under stress. The heart rate goes up, your blood pressure rate goes up. And again, not so bad unless it's prolonged and really, really frequent. So we talk about toxic stress and brain architecture and why this is important, especially for children who are experiencing a lot of trauma, maltreatment, whatever's going on in the family, for example. Their brains are on high alert all the time. All of that stuff's racing. My cortisol's always like, oh my gosh, take care of this. My heart rate's always up. I'm in a fear-related state most of the time. And what happens is that can actually keep your brain from growing and developing those connections, and it can wire you to have a very low stress threshold. So you see danger in situations where there is no danger because you're very hypervigilant. You're focused on reading threat in your environment. That's a good thing if there really is danger environment, but it's maladaptive if you're seeing danger where it doesn't exist. So, for example, when we work with early childhood people, we're talking all the time about kids in daycare, for example, who all of a sudden go off and you don't know why. Well, maybe there was something in their environment that really triggered that reaction because they felt threatened and they didn't feel safe. So what we know about early trauma is it really can change the shape and the size of your brain. It creates a low threshold for stress. It can give you heightened anxiety, impaired reasoning, cognitive defects because I can't get to my cortex if I'm always on high alert, and it can suppress my immune system, which creates lifelong health problems. So if you go back to this idea, this is your brain, the stem, the emotional part of your brain, the thinking, logical part of your brain, what happens is when the amygdala, the middle of your brain, gets activated, you can do what's called flip your lid. This is like going so fast that I flip my lid. And what that means is my cortex out here, my prefrontal cortex where I really make decisions, is out here and I can't reach it. So I have to calm myself down and bring my cortex down so my brain can all connect. And when we're like this all this time, we can't make good decisions. So for kids, for parents, for teenagers, if we just understand when we're like this, we have to breathe, we have to take some time, we have to calm ourselves down, and then we can do better thinking and better decisions. So with that, I'm going to close by saying there's a lot of hope out there because we're discovering so much about how this works. And we know a lot about resilience, and we're going to talk about that later in our workshop and what that looks like and how do you build that. And we know a lot about protective factors because we know we can put things in place that make things go better for all of us, especially for our kids and our teenagers. So with that, I'm going to turn it to Pat.
I've done this about 12 times with Shirley, and it's getting harder and harder to follow her. She's really good. The first 10 times I was nervous thinking about my part, and then recently I actually listened to her and went, wow, she's got a lot of good things to say. Thanks, Shirley. So I'm going to switch and talk a little bit about data, not always the most exciting topic, but how many people have heard of the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study? Awesome. Okay. From what I understand, 10 years ago, it would have been one person maybe. The study's been around for 20 years now. And what happened was that Kaiser Permanente, insurance company, a health insurance company in San Diego, was doing an obesity reduction program. And as part of that, they found that some people would lose weight and then put it right back on. And Vincent Folletti, who was the doctor who was doing it, was doing an interview with a woman who had done just that, put the weight right back on. And he was going through a long list of questions, and he misspoke. And he meant to ask her, what was your weight the last time you had sex? And instead he said, what was your weight the first time you had sex? And she said 42 pounds. And it occurred to him, we've got trauma here. And as they began to explore it, this idea came into his mind. And he connected with Rob Anda at the CDC, and they proceeded to do a study with 17,000 people in the Kaiser Permanente health plan, primarily white middle-class folks in San Diego with health insurance, highly educated compared to the general public. And they asked them about 10 different adverse childhood experiences that had occurred to them from birth to age 18. Well, as you can imagine, having 17,000 people and having their health records and then follow-up capability, it has been a gold mine of information. And these are what they ask about: physical abuse and neglect, emotional abuse and neglect, sexual abuse, whether or not there was someone abusing alcohol or drugs in the family, someone was incarcerated, household mental illness, domestic violence, or separation and divorce. And these are the results from that really not at-risk population. These are the percentage of people who reported experiencing those conditions prior to age 18. It stunned them. Rob Anda talks about, the CDC scientist said he wept when he got these results. Because if you think back in the 70s, physicians were taught that sexual abuse was a 1 in a million occurrence. So things have evolved. And as a result of this, they developed what they called an ACE score. And so this is how it works. If someone answered, yes, I was physically abused, they got an ACE score of 1. Now, the weakness of the study is that if they were physically abused once or 300 times, they still got an ACE score of 1. So it's not a real precise measure. It also doesn't measure whether it happened at age 3 or at age 17. And we know from what Shirley just talked about developmentally, the earlier trauma happens, the more impact it's going to have on outcomes for people. But still, this is what they found. So of a possible score of 10, 2/3 had at least one adverse childhood experience. So it was a common occurrence. And the reason they came to an ACE score is because there's a great deal of overlap. And we'll talk about that with the Alaska-specific data. So if you have one, the likelihood of having another is higher. So then they started to look at the results. See if my pointer works here. So we look here at folks if they'd ever had a drug problem. The way to read this is the dark blue column is people with 0 adverse childhood experiences. So it's less than 2% ever had a drug problem if they had 0 adverse childhood experiences. Up to, 14% if they had 5 or more ACEs. So this stair step, the more ACEs you get, the more likely you are to have the outcome, showed up over and over again. And I'm told that in epidemiology, if you get this stair step with a dose response, it's your career. They have hundreds of them, okay? So here, ever addicted to drugs, same thing. Ever injected drugs, mostly that stair step over and over. Well, I could stand up here for the next hour and show you slides from that original study that show the same thing. The greater the dose of trauma, the more likely you are to experience a poor outcome. So before I go on, I want to put in a little caveat here. This is in a population. So for an individual, it's not predictive. As you can see, for people in this category of 5+ ACEs, 13% ever had a drug problem. But remember, that means 87% didn't. So what was going on for those people? And that's part of the resilience and trauma-informed care and community wellness that we'll talk about later in our workshop. But just so you know, this is in a population and is not predictive for individuals. So again, I could show you slide after slide with these stair steps, but this might be a little more effective. These are the 42 things that public health people in the United States want to watch over the next 10 years. And of those, 28, at least, have been linked in peer-reviewed journal articles with ACEs. This is not an exhaustive list. We could also add home ownership goes down with more ACEs. Income goes down with more ACEs. Absenteeism goes down with more ACEs. So this is really an incredible opportunity to impact a whole host of health problems. So about 4 years ago, folks at the Alaska Mental Health Board and Advisory Board on Alcoholism and Drug Abuse, along with some other partners, decided that we really needed to know what was going on in Alaska. So we went after that data. And we did it through the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System, or the BRFIS. I'll call it the BRFIS. It's not my cousin BRFIS. But this is a study that's done every year. It's a phone survey. We phone landlines and cell lines all over the state. It's a weighted sample when it's all done. So in other words, the folks put it together and it represents Alaska. So demographically, we have the right number of rural folks and women and men and by race. And anyway, it's all weighted to reflect Alaska. And the great thing about this is that we also ask about 130 other health, economic, and social questions. So when we got our answers to our ACE scores, we also could cross-tab that with how people responded to those questions. We were the 21st state in 2013 to do it. Just so you know, we asked them in 2014, and those data will be coming available in a month or two, and we're currently asking them. So by the end of this, we're going to have 3 years, and we really will be able to have a strong picture of what's going on, for example, in Juneau, because our numbers will be big enough that we can have some statistically valid results. So this is what we found in Alaska. I'll let you look at that for a minute. Anything surprising there to anyone? For me, this number was shocking. That 10% of our adults said that someone in their home growing up went to jail or prison. Seems very high. So in order to provide a little context, there are no national rates of adverse childhood experiences. But because those 20 states have done the same survey that we did, we can compare to 5 states because the CDC put 5 states together for us. And these are not, they were not magically chosen. They were just states that had data available. And they are, I added the list so I don't have to do my geography here. Arkansas, Louisiana, New Mexico, Tennessee, and Washington. Again, not magic, but that represents about 26 million people. They did the exact same survey we did, and we can compare our results to theirs and maybe get a little context. So this is what we found. Alaska is in the orange column, and those are percentages. And then the other states across. I'll give you a few seconds to look at that. Yes, sir.
A lot of these numbers probably inaccurate because of the lack of reporting from our rural villages in Alaska.
So the rural villages are represented in this in an appropriate, mathematically appropriate, statistically valid way. In fact, one of the things we do is we oversample in rural areas to make sure that we have enough. It's a valid point, and just so you know, we estimate that these are low because if you think about a phone survey, we're not contacting people in prison and other institutions. So, but again, that's true in other states as well. So again, this is just to provide some context. The thing that I think is surprising to me is how close we are to Washington State in this. So the comment was about the prison population and how we have a large percentage of folks in and there are no beds and people are going out of state. And as you can see, when we compare with what people were saying, again, this is what happened in their household prior to age 18. We're just asking adults here, that 11% said that someone was incarcerated. And when we compare that to the other states, it's significantly higher. And we'll dig into that number a little bit here in a minute. So this just shows the circles are the highest of the 5 states, and you can see that in 4 out of 8, we're the highest. Yes? Right. Right. The comment was made that Washington, New Mexico, and Alaska have high native populations, and we know about things like historical trauma and obviously racism that continue, that can impact these. So when we put those 5 states together by ACE score, make an average of the 5 states, this is how we compare in Alaska. And you can see in the first category of 0 ACEs, which is the category we want as high as possible, we're about 5 percentage points different. So if we were to move to the level, just for an example or a little more context, if we were to move to the level of those 5 states, we'd have about 28,000 more Alaskans in that category, Alaskan adults. Okay. So I want to take you through one adverse childhood experience, the questions and some of the results from it, because it's illustrative of all of them to some extent. And this is the question that was asked about physical abuse. Before age 18, how often did a parent or adult in your home ever hit, beat, kick, or physically hurt you? Do not include spanking. And then the choices are once, more than once, or never. And if Alaskan adults reported once or more than once, they got an ACE score of 1 for that. So that's how it worked. These are our results by gender, and the star at the top means it's statistically significantly different from the 5 states. So one of the very interesting things about this, because we're asking people about what happened in their childhood, is it gives us a window back in time. And this just shows that people in our survey, age 55 and older, all came of age in the late 70s, just to give you a little. And then for the 18 to 24, we're talking about, like 1990 to the present. So gives you a little idea. And then I put a few things here on the timeline down below, just for a little more context. Statehood, money starts to flow, the mental health trust starts, and then when we surveyed. And these are the results by those age groups compared to the 5 states. Now, one of the reasons why we want to compare to the 5 states is because, for example, it's true that people with very high ACE scores tend to die early, on average 20 years earlier. So comparing one generation in a population to another generation can get a little tricky. You also have issues like in the young adult population. Are people really ready to tell the story about what happened in their youth? Maybe it's too close. And you get, of course, changing social mores as well. So by comparing it to Alaskan age groups to the 5 states, we account for some of this, okay? And here's what we find, that we are significantly higher in physical abuse in our older generations. In our younger generations, we are comparable statistically. And this was surprising to me. I didn't expect this. We see this over and over by individual ACE score. We are holding our higher ACEs in our older generation compared to the other states. So the question is, why? I'd like to say it's because of great social services, and I'm sure that's part of it. I'd like to say it's because of good jobs, and I'm sure that's part of it too. But there's also in-migration. There's a whole lot of things going on here. But I think relative to those other states, it is over and over true that we are holding our higher ACE scores in the older generations. And I think that is perhaps a story, oddly enough, to celebrate, in that some of our older folks experienced a great deal of trauma, but have passed it on, in general, at a lower level. And this is something to celebrate. So these are all the categories of adverse childhood experiences, and this slide shows Alaska as a percentage of the 5 states. So if we were exactly the same as the 5 states, we'd be right at 100%, or the dark line up there. And you can see everyone is above 100%, and the 2 brown columns are not statistically different, and those are domestic violence and household mental illness. And we'll run this analysis again when we have 2 years worth of data, and that'll sharpen our analysis a little more. This is the same analysis, but putting each adverse childhood experience and comparing Alaska's rate to the 5 states' rate by those generations or by those age groups. And you can see in our 18 to 24, we are really bunched right around the 100%. There's no statistically significant difference in that age group between our rates and the 5 states. And in our 55 plus, every single one is higher and statistically higher. So now we move to some of the outcomes. This is a question where we ask, have you ever been diagnosed with depression or dysthymia? And this is, again, the same stair step, but this is Alaskan adults reporting on their childhood. About 7% of people with 0 ACEs reported ever having been depressed or diagnosed with depression, and 35% with 4 or more. I'll show you the website, and so that you can look. There are hundreds of slides on the website, so you can look at an enormous number of measures, and we're just going to show a few. So here's a couple that I found interesting that I really haven't seen done in any other state. The orange column is, were you ever hungry in the last month and didn't eat because you didn't have food? And 42% of the people in Alaska with 4 or more ACEs of the adults said yes. 4 out of 10. So that's happening right now. And then the other, they cut back meals because they couldn't get the food they needed, cut back on what they ate. And again, stair steps. Yeah.
We can,
Talk about food security, again, I'm going back to urban. I think those numbers are quite low. First of all, there we go. Sorry about that. Anyway, I want to introduce myself. My name is Rob Sanderson. I serve as the second chair for the Central Council. And one of the issues that I'm charged with is protecting our native food security. And I testify before federal boards, state boards on fisheries. You know, a lot of our fishing rights are being taken from us in rural Alaska. And believe me when I tell you this, it's going to start happening to the citizens of Juneau, the Ketchikan's, the Sitkas. They're not going to be immune from this anymore. It's going to happen. And you know, when you start taking away our food security, you know, our fisheries, hunting, whatever, we have to understand that a lot of this is going to out-of-state people that come to visit our state. And 93%. Huh? Yes, the question is, where are you getting your data on this? Because in some villages up north, they are restricted from even fishing and collecting food to feed their families.
This data is from all over the state, and it's based on the population of Alaska. So native villages are represented in proportion to the population. So these numbers are very high. It may be very different when we look at specific local areas. So this is a statewide figure.
Okay, and I'll leave it at this because it ties into, you know, how our people feel about their culture. And, you know, when you take away something that they've been practicing for millennia, they are going to start taking their lives. And some of these villages can't even fish to feed their families,
Right.
you know, because there's so much regulation on it
Right.
by the state and the feds. So, you know.
Well, it's certainly a valid data point that
It's a
maybe
very valid
perhaps
one.
we can explore when we get a bigger pool.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So this slide is what's called population, or calculates what's called population attributable risk. And in epidemiology, I have learned, and by the way, Much like Shirley is not a neurologist, I apparently am not a mathematician. I've tried to do this calculation, and I instead relied on people like Alice and her former colleagues to do it for me. But this is a calculation that is well respected in epidemiology, and what it shows is the percentage of a problem, in this case, for example, current smoking, that would disappear if we eliminated all adverse childhood experiences. So if we did not have child trauma, based on the questions we asked, 32% fewer adults would be smoking. That's the way to look at this. One of the things we really went after on this is this wedge, as you can imagine, in the legislature. 40% fewer people on Medicaid is a significant number. I'll say that would be a savings to the state of about $350 million a year if we had 40% fewer adults on Medicaid. So this slide is very dense, but I think hopefully you'll have this and can really spend some time with it. And the way to read this slide is, is say, for example, you work in a domestic violence shelter. And this is what Alaskan adults tell us. If they experienced domestic violence in their home as a child, 55% of them also experienced physical abuse. That's the way to read this. So if you're working in a domestic violence shelter and someone comes in with 2 kids, I think, if it continues as our adults tell us for kids today, that half of those kids will either have or will, before age 18, experience physical abuse. You can see, I keep pushing the wrong button. If you experience physical abuse, 78% of those people also experience verbal abuse. Anyway, so this is a very rich slide that really takes a lot of time to kind of spend and think about in terms of the work that you do. And again, it's not predictive for an individual, but it gives us some background to think about as we deal with people, because often people come in and they'll tell us one thing, but not other things that have happened, at least initially, until we develop that relationship. I throw this in because this is kind of a downer, but we know how to build resilience. Shirley talked about it, serve and return with those babies, with those kids, with each other. We know how to do it. It's all about relationships. I'm going to go through this rather quickly because I'm running out of time, but we ask high school students every year questions about suicide. And we also ask them about some protective factors. So I'm going to show you some results from those students, about 13,000 Alaskan high school students. And I put together a classroom of 30, but this is based on 13,000 responses, 13,000 kids. And assuming in this classroom, these are students who think that they matter in their community, okay? If we had a classroom, typical classroom of Alaskan students who thought they mattered in their community, 3 out of 30 would have considered suicide in the previous year. If we put a classroom together of students who think they don't matter in their community, 11 out of 30 would have considered suicide in the past year. Here's the comparison side by side. Protective factors matter, and Shirley and I will talk about that in our presentation. Lastly, we plugged in Alaska. So one of the questions we didn't ask on the Burfus is suicide, about suicide attempts or suicide, but one of the original ACE studies did. And so we plugged in Alaska's ACE rates into their calculation. This is an artifice, but it's illustrative. So this is what we would expect. In Alaskan adults, about 27,000 people at some point would attempt suicide. Adults would attempt suicide in their lifetime, given our ACE rates. And then I'm going to show you what it would look like if we reduced 1 ACE for everybody who had one, or 2. We'd have 17,600 if we reduced 1 ACE. Just to give you an idea, in a 72-year lifetime, That's one fewer suicide attempt every 3 days. We can impact suicide by reducing trauma. There's some cards on your table. They have some facts on them. It's really, though, just a vehicle to get you to the website, which is there. So they've got some facts, and you can read. There are 24 different cards. You can, on the website, you can read about the data behind all the cards. You can find out about trauma-informed care, the Harvard Brain website. There's a lot of information specific to Alaska on there as well. Here it is right here. Sorry, I work for the state, so it is the lamest web address ever. But you can also Google Adverse Childhood Experiences Alaska and also get to it, but don't Google ACEs Alaska because you'll get hockey. Thank you.